By request, today we are looking at counter fairies. Despite the recent release of a new structure deck and some new support, counter fairies have struggled to find a place in the existing meta. Looking at an example of the so-called as advertised best counter fairy deck in the game, the design is not my cup of tea for multiple reasons. Overall, counter fairies historically have had two major problems. The first problem is that their shtick obviously involves counter traps. But an inherent problem with counter traps is first, they're traps. And second, no generic counter traps produce really anything better than a break even one for one. And there are very few archetype specific counter traps that have any real plus capacity, but those really aren't appropriate for a counter fairy deck because they're tied to certain specific archetype activation conditions. The second big problem with counter fairies is similar to Gemini monsters. For the type of deck design that interacts with a particular mechanic. For Gemini monsters, it was having to summon them again, the double summoning aspect. And for counter fairies, it's obviously their interaction with counter traps. The monster effects that work in collaboration with counter traps, i.e., what you get from those monsters in correspondence activation of counter traps, isn't better than a lot of generic cards. Again, similar to Gemini monsters. It was, why do I need to spend the time to use this second summons mechanic when I can just play generic monster X and basically get the effect that Gemini monster would have gotten after I summon him for another time? Same thing here. Okay, I could run this relatively unsearchable card, put it on the field, then have to activate a counter trap to get this bonus effect. Why would I do all that, jump through all those hoops when I can just run generic card X? So the deck design demands multiple card investment for results that can typically be acquired for less resources in a lot of other archetypes. Also, due to the nature of the requirement of counter traps for these effects are largely front-runner effects rather than strong comeback effects or game-defining neutral board-changing effects. These two problems create significant inefficiencies in speed and resource management, where the most pressing element is a lack of ability to come from behind. Basically, the natural elements of a counter fairy deck are unable to reliably break an established board and come back in general. When looking at this best counter fairy deck, it is very difficult to expect to win with this deck when going second, and even when going first. Victory is not that high because of the overall lack of power for maintaining field presence of the monsters involved. You can't just put a monster on the field and that monster will do a lot of work for you in controlling the field. Most of the counter fairy monsters are, I put the monster on the field, it works in collaboration with counter trap. So if I don't have a number of counter traps backing that card up, then I get basically nothing, and I can't stop my opponent from developing their board. But if I don't get that monster, I don't get bonus effects. So basically all my counter traps are just one for ones. Maybe I get a few negatives for my opponent if they go into their extra deck, but for the most part, they're typically going to be able to create their board, and I lose. Basically, the fairy player needs to open with a good monster and multiple counter traps to even have a fair chance at victory against a lot of other competitive decks in this given meta. Therefore, I feel it's important to design the deck in such a way that it can win going second, because if you can't win going second, it's almost what's the point of even showing up to a tournament if you're pretty much saying, I need to use my two-headed coin here to have any real chance of doing well in this tournament. And this common meta build that is billed as the best counter fairy deck, for me, it's not the answer. First, before we begin, we'll do a little review of the new support that came out in the structure deck. In a sense, Sacred Arch-Airknight Parshath is the first boss monster for the archetype, and despite its lack of popularity with some other players, it is a solid card. It has an easily achieved innate special summoning ability. Its 2800 attack is solid as a board clearer, and its commonly nets a +1 from the deck in a Parshath or counter trap search when dealing damage, and due to the fact that it has piercing, which is a trait of the Parshath monsters, it will almost always net that search when successfully attacking. However, with the special summoning condition extending to the graveyard, currently running one copy is appropriate versus multiple copies for that extra searchability due to another new card, with another copy in the side deck for dealing with cards like DD Crow or Called by the Grave if your opponent happens to be running those options. The summons of Arch-Airknight receives a strong shot in the arm from the new counter trap, Rebith of Parshath. This counter trap is just a much better quasi-archetype based Ultimate Providence. Like Ultimate, you have the beautiful flexibility of negating a monster, spell, or trap effect. But unlike Ultimate, you do not need to have a matching type in hand to discard. Any single discard will suffice, and the negated card is spun back to the deck, not destroyed, which evades cards with anti-destruction effects or that receive effects when destroyed or while in the graveyard, limiting the options for your opponent. Spin is better than destroying a monster about 99.9% of the time. Not only does the card negate, but it allows the summons of a Parshath monster from the deck or extra deck to balance out this card. These advantages are certainly worth the additional 1,000 life point payment that goes along with the activation of the card and the requirement of having a counter trap in your hand to activate it in the first place. In my opinion, you should always run 3 copies. Sadly, while the 2 aforementioned cards definitely have a place in a counter deck, although they don't do a lot to fix the problems that are inherent to a counter fairy deck, the other 3 new cards are limited in their overall value. First, Power Angel Valkyria does not fix any of the problems of the deck. It does act as a solid front-runner card, but little else. The Light Fairy Search is always welcome, but only a few monsters like the Negation Heralds, green, purple, orange, or Ariadne have immediate advantage, making the usefulness of the search limited. Similar to one of the ongoing problems of the deck, requiring a negation further limits the value of the card, but at least it only requires a negation, not a counter trap based negation. You could run 1 copy. One of the biggest problems of Valkyria is a problem that somewhat haunts the counter fairy archetype. It's not really searchable. Minerva has a similar front-runner nature for without innate protection, the increased attack power is really not that useful, for it commonly takes too long for the card to power up, as it were, and once again, it's really only useful when the opponent has not established the board, or the game is entrenched neutral in a sense, where it has time to power up. The front-runner nature of the card is really established with the graveyard recovery effect. It's one of those cards that looks good on paper, but in practice, it just does not get the job done, in my opinion. I skip it. Finally, the last new card is the Sanctum of Parshath, another card that seems to look good on paper, but for me, just does not get it done either. I do not run Sanctum because the problem with this card is that it doesn't really do anything to positively advance your game state in a I'm behind or neutral way. And when it's added to your hand via a draw or a search, it displaces another card that typically could do something better. The attack power increase is somewhat irrelevant. The Sanctuary in the Sky name is not that useful, seeing how many different ways this deck can add the real McCoy if you want to run the real McCoy. So the back row protection is really the only useful effect, and realistically, that back row protection, in my eyes, comes down to really don't get your stuff twin twistered. For your back row could still be Hey Trunated, and there are other better cards, in my opinion, for stopping Twin Twister than actually just outright disallowing its activation or this card being a magnet for it, so to speak. The deck stacking effect is also a somewhat front runner effect. The fact that this card prevents all face-down back row destruction is kind of a weird design choice. It just doesn't protect your back row, it protects your opponent's back row as well. I love it when Konami designs cards that provide similar field benefits to both players with no resource demand from the opponent to receive that effect. Oh, I have to have the burden of having the card in my deck. I have to spend time getting the card via just drawing it, which I could draw something else, or searching for it. I have to activate the card, but then, oh, both players get the effects of that card. No, give it to me, not my opponent. So with the new support now reviewed, let's look at the deck. For the fairy counter type monsters, I run 3 copies of the general staple Bountiful Artemis, which is standard for these decks for its draw effect, along with 3 copies of Guiding Ariadne, which is another solid choice for its pendulum effect, eliminates cost for counter trap, which goes a long way, especially with those involving discards and life point payment, which is most of them, to, in a sense, not hurting yourself so much that it just makes it that much easier for your opponent to defeat you. Depending on the circumstances, the monster effect can also be useful, but don't expect it a lot because I'm not running the principal card that typically triggers the monster effect in this build. And the simple fact is, it's a lot more valuable in your pendulum zone than it is acting as a monster. Most of the time, for me, when I get the monster effect, is because my opponent wants to get rid of it. That covers the so-called fairy counter trap type monsters in my deck. You can see the pickings are somewhat spartic because another problem is that in the entire fairy archetype, it doesn't really have quality monsters with spot removal effects, making it difficult to come from behind. Therefore, for the rest of the monsters, board control is important. 2 copies of Honest for attack power, along with 3 copies of Eater of Millions, which can be devastating in this deck due to Eater being backed up by various counter traps. Closing out the monsters, with the focus on board clearing to supplement the counter trap strategy of this deck, I like running 3 copies of Metaion, the Timelord, to bounce all monsters at the end of the battle phase after it battles back to the hand, and I get some nice burn damage, and 2 copies of its partner in crime, so to speak, Time Maiden, to dramatically ease summons and utilization of Metaion. The problem with running 3 copies in my experience with Time Maiden is sometimes you just see it too often. And Time Maiden's not a great card because your opponent might not have a board. And so if your opponent doesn't have a board, summoning Metaion doesn't really make any sense. So Time Maiden just becomes a dead draw. Some may wonder, where are the Luster Pendulum Draco Slayers due to the nice interaction they have with Ariadne, in addition to being a decent hitter at 1850 and giving you access to Ignister. The problem with Luster in this deck is, while it has a great interaction with Ariadne, it is basically a dead draw in my opinion otherwise, and I choose not to take on that dead draw risk in this deck, which already has significant handicap. It's definitely a card that's worth running if you are willing to accept that risk. I'm not. Some may also wonder, where are your other kind of counter fairy trap trigger cards? And I don't really run them. You'll see I don't run Sanctuary in the Skies, so that takes a lot of stock out of running a lot of the other cards. Again, they have the big problem with this archetype. They're fairly front-runnery, their bonus effects aren't that useful, and they're rather difficult to search. For the spells, I run my standard 1 copy of Raigeki, 1 copy of Darkhole, and 1 copy of Upstart Goblin. Raigeki and Darkhole are clearly important in this deck for field clearance, especially if you go second or if you don't draw enough counter traps to stop your opponent from going off, even if you end up going first. For the traps, I run the understandable and predictable 3 copies of Solemn Strike, 1 Solemn Warning, and 1 Solemn Judgment to support the counter trap mentality, along with the somewhat forgotten 2 copies of Blackhorn of Heaven. I think everyone jumped off the Blackhorn of Heaven bandwagon once it had its errata way back when. It was like, oh my gosh, we can't use it to negate the pendulum summons of 4 monsters anymore. This card sucks. Really? Black Horn of Heaven, I get to negate the special summons of one monster for free? Just the card? No costs associated with it? I'll take it. However, unlike a lot of the other counter trap builds, I go rather heavy on non-counter traps as well, in 3 copies of Torrential Tribute and 3 copies of Drowning Mirror Force to help clear boards. Now, some may argue, whoa, Drowning Mirror Force? Why Drowning? Well, I don't really like using regular standard Mirror Force because it just destroys. Storming is good, but sometimes bouncing back to the hand just isn't enough because your opponent will just spit out a big board to follow up with all the pluses they got in making the previous big board. Drowning Mirror Force is more of a sledgehammer card. It really creates board differential change, and that's what's important, I feel, for this deck. And the fact that you need a clear board to activate it, not a big deal, because the simple reality is most of the time you'll either be winning and your counter traps will be dictating the flow of the duel, or you'll be losing and you need that sledgehammer that Drowning Mirror Force can provide, and something like Storming Mirror Force or regular Mirror Force might not be able to. So we see that there are 3 card spots remaining. One certainly can run Evenly Matched. Another set of counter traps if you want to run Ultimate Providence, despite Rebirth being a much better card in my opinion. You can also run Floodgates like Anti-Spell Fragrance, with most of your cards being fairies. You can run something like Rivalry of Warlords. Or you can run the card that I choose to run, 3 copies of Pot of Duality for deck thinning and increasing setup ability. The lack of a special summons during your turn is really not commonly a big deal for this deck. Some may note I do not run Card of Demise in this build. I do not like Card of Demise in this build because overall it is either a win more card or somewhat worthless without generic field clearance, for unless you open Card of Demise going first, it just doesn't do a lot for this deck in my opinion, due to the tempo problems this deck has with the type of monsters it commonly runs, which can be exacerbated with the lower monster count preferred in the Demise build. In a sense, Card of Demise works because of flaws in the opponent's deck design, not necessarily because it's such a great card in this deck. It's also worth noting that I don't run Ties of the Brethren. People who are familiar with my deck design know I just don't like that card. I don't think it's very good. It's similar in a context of Card of Demise in this build. If you don't open it going first turn, good luck getting a lot of use out of it. The 2,000 life point payment is also somewhat prohibitive in this deck because you're going to be paying life points for your Solemns. Also, you're not getting a lot of quality monsters on the field. Finally, as previously mentioned, I don't run Sanctuary in the Sky or any monsters with Sky bonus effects. I just feel Sky is too inconsistent in this build and too big of a removal magnet for various other cards. Also, as previously mentioned with the Gemini comparison, in the introduction of this deck build, the bonus effects received when Sky is on the field for negation or counter trap activation, they're just muted. They're just not powerful enough for running Sky, as Sky is somewhat of a mediocre card in and of itself. For the extra deck, it is rather irrelevant outside of 2 copies of Avenging Knight Parshath for Rebirth Parshath summoning element. You can run some Linkuribohs for use with the Time Maidens. Overall, though, the extra deck is just not valuable. It's largely there just as a summoning pool for your Eater of Millions. In the end, Counter Fairies may be the biggest front-runner deck in the game. Unfortunately, in a pure context, it is one of the worst come-from-behind decks in the game. My play strategy with this build is to attempt to clear the board as much as possible to maximize the usefulness of the counter trap, as well as open up avenues for attack. This deck has trouble plussing, so to win, you commonly need to apply potential heavy minuses to the opponent. The strategy for this deck is to try to keep the board as clear as possible every turn, so that you're basically just pecking away at the life points, almost in a sense, death by 1,000 cuts, because if you play this deck, regardless of how the build is particularly structured, playing Counter Fairies means strapping yourself in and The longer the duel goes, the higher your probability of winning. But commonly, you're not going to be winning until turn like 8, 10, 12 plus, because you don't have a lot of firepower. And the chief strategy is to try to limit the amount of firepower your opponent can throw against you. Overall, I just find it difficult to look at pure counter fairies as a real competitive deck because of its just outstanding aforementioned inherent problem that the new support did not fix at all. Well, that is my counter fairy deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.